Good evening. Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to see everyone tonight. I have the pleasure of introducing our Kennedy Lecture Series speaker, Ms. Julie Cohen. Ms. Cohen's most recent work includes co-directing the Oscar-nominated documentary RBG, starring Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Her films have screened at more than 80 festivals, and she has won 3 New York Emmy Awards since 2012. Other notable works of hers include American Veteran, The Sturgeon Queens, and I Love to Sing. She was a former NBC News staff producer, and she still does consulting projects for NBC. Julie graduated from Colgate and holds master's degrees from Yale Law School and the Columbia Journalism School, where she is now an adjunct professor. Please join me in welcoming tonight's Kennedy Lecture Series speaker, Ms. Julie Cohen.
Hi everyone. Quickly, I'll introduce myself. I am Lindsay Martin. I am brand new to OU in the School of Film as the new assistant professor of film. So I'm happy to be here tonight, here with Julie Cohen. Thank you so much for being with us and for joining us this evening to talk about your amazing film career.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So we're going to get right into it. We're going to have a talk, and then for the last 20 or so minutes, we'll open it up for some discussion. So if you have burning questions, we will have some microphones set up and we can line up, but I'll cue you when to do that. So Julie, yes, can you talk about how you got into documentary filmmaking? I know you spent some of your background, you went to law school, you worked in news, you worked on Dateline in the 90s, up through the aughts, and how it kind of brought you to actual documentary making.
Yeah, telling stories for TV news and making documentaries really is the same work. You're just trying to find things that are interesting in the world and present them in a way that hopefully will be illuminating and entertaining for people. I think maybe the main difference is often the subject matter that one can approach. Obviously, as a Dateline producer, I was doing a lot of true crime stories, which I enjoyed doing, but was also kind of like a dark place to be on a personal level. And I, after about 9 years of doing that, I decided that I wanted to take the storytelling skills that I developed at Dateline and also at Court TV, where I had worked previously, and move them towards telling some of the kind of stories that I wanted to tell. And in some ways, there isn't that much that connects subject matter, the films that I've made since then, but one thing that I will say is they've basically all been very happy, uplifting, often funny, delicious, like that. That's kind of what I'm looking for. I mean, ironically, in the time that I've been in the doc world, true crime has been of more and more interest in all different forums, and so sometimes someone will become aware of my roots and background, like, oh, that's great, we've got this great true crime project for you to work on, and so yeah, just as my life has evolved, I just find myself really gravitating towards positivity, towards humor, towards arts and music and dance and food, and also towards the elderly, frankly. I mean, you know, one of the in the broadcast, in the network news world, you're aiming for the so-called demographic that advertisers want to see. That's 18 to 49. And it was almost, I mean, this isn't literally true, but you almost felt like you had to get special dispensation to interview someone over age 50. The first project that I did after leaving NBC was actually something for New York PBS called New York Goes to War. That was about New Yorkers who had fought in World War II and what New York was like during World War II. And for that project, I interviewed, I think about 10 or 12 people, all of whom were between 85 and 95. And I was just astounded by what fantastic interviews they were. And at that time I was like, okay, I never want to talk to anyone under 90 again. Like this is, and although that's not literally, I haven't literally stuck to that, but I have really gravitated towards stories about older people, and I sort of tried to think of the reason, like, why were these interviews so special? And I think there's a number of reasons. One is that, you know, people who've lived a long time have had a lot of interesting experiences and have more to say. Another is that I think some of the desire to impress and kind of package your story for someone else has gone away. People are just get a little more honest as time goes on. But I think part of it is really not just age, but generational. You know, interviewing people who were not put in front of a television set at age 3 years old or now in front of a screen allows for almost like a more a wider breadth of the ways that people speak. I mean, I often found when we were interviewing for Dateline that sometimes you'd sit down with someone and they would start talking like the way that someone on Dateline talks. Like, even, and this even included like an incarcerated, you know, murderer. Like, it's like, did you see our show last week? Because like you sound like, you know, there's just sort of like a way that people like talk, like, oh, you know, our wedding was almost like a, you know, it felt like a fairy tale. You know, and I found that, you know, in this different generation, there was just like more uniqueness to the way people spoke. So those are some of the things I gravitated towards. But really, it's the same process. In many ways, actually, it's more difficult to make a 2-hour Dateline episode probably than to make a documentary. I would say, because you're actually doing something that you know, you're really trying to make sure that 8 million people are going to want to see it, rather than sometimes being able to focus on a specialty of interest.
Well, that kind of brings us up to your last film, which was RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg documentary. Hopefully all of you have seen it. If you haven't, you can.
If you haven't, you should leave right now and go on to Hulu or Amazon Prime.
But before we get into more specific questions about that, let's go ahead and watch the trailer for it, just to refresh everybody's memory.
I ask no favor for my sex. All I ask of our brethren is that they take their feet off our necks.
We welcome today Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
She's become such an icon.
Do you mind signing this copy?
I am 84 years old and everyone wants to take a picture with me.
Notorious RBG. Yeah.
When you come right down to it, the closest thing to a superhero I know. Ruth Bader Ginsburg changed the way the world is for American women.
I became a lawyer when women were not wanted by the legal profession.
Thousands of state and federal laws discriminated on the basis of gender. She was following in the footsteps of the battle for racial equality. She wanted equal protection for women.
Men and women are persons of equal dignity, and they should count equally before the law.
She captured for the male members of the court what it was like to be a second-class citizen.
The point is that the discriminatory line almost inevitably hurts women.
I did see myself as kind of a kindergarten teacher in those days because the judges didn't think sex discrimination existed.
I have had the great good fortune to share life with a partner truly extraordinary for his generation.
He was the first boy I ever knew who cared that I had a brain.
She is a center of power on and off the court.
Every time Justice Ginsburg wrote a dissent, the internet would explode.
I came up with a couple slogans. You can't spell truth without Ruth.
I surely would not be in this room today without the determined efforts of men and women who kept dreams alive.
I've heard that she does 20 push-ups 3 times a week or something. I mean, we can't even get off the floor. We can't even get down to the floor.
That's true.
So, I mean, this question, how did you even begin to make this documentary? I know you worked closely with your co-director, Betsy West. How did you all come to the conclusion that that Justice Ginsburg was going to be the subject of your documentary?
So Betsy and I had each interviewed Justice Ginsburg previously for different projects, and so we were quite aware of her amazing story. I had interviewed her in 2013. Betsy had interviewed her in 2011, and it was soon after that Justice Ginsburg really blew up, as they say, on the internet. All of the memes and all of the just her as a viral internet sensation just kind of went crazy. And so we just said, you know, someone's got to make a documentary about this woman, and why shouldn't it be us? And we wrote her an email. You know, we did have the benefit of each knowing her a bit, so we knew that our email would actually get to her, which was good. And we really tore our hair out for days over the exact wording of this email. The Justice is notoriously finicky about any kind of grammatical error, spelling mistake. In fact, her own children said that she would like take her red pen and like send them back letters with like corrections. I don't know if that's literally true, but they say it's true. Harry Edwards, a close friend of Justice Ginsburg's, who served with her on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, where he's still a judge and who's interviewed in our film, said that when she first got to that court, she would do the same thing. Like, you'd circulate a draft opinion, and here, like, she's the new girl, and she's like, so, you know, she's got little red pen marks, like scratching out people's mistakes. Anyway, so we were paranoid about this. We sent her an email with the audacious proposal that she might be the subject of a documentary by us telling her life story. And we got a response from her very quickly, which essentially said, not yet. We really looked over, her answer was maybe like 3 or 4 sentences, and we looked over it really, really closely, like thinking, and we made an observation, which was that 2 words that did not appear in her response were no and never. So we essentially took her, you know, dejecting, and I'm feeling bad for the ASL interpreters at this moment, because I realize dejecting isn't really a word, but her negative email as a yes, because what is not yet, if not soon, like later. And so we basically spent the next 1.5 years figuring out how we could get her to let us make a film. I think the key thing, and I'm not sure how many of you here are students or are students in the film or journalism departments. Could you raise your hands if you are? Yeah, so there's a number of you. Okay, so here's, oh my goodness, so here's where the lesson part comes in, which is, you know, when you have a project that you really want to do and you put out the requests to the relevant people, whether they be funders, whether they be a platform that would potentially show your program, whether it's the subjects that you're trying to do it up, when it's things that you really care about, the answer is almost never just like yes. You never get like, great, let's go. That's just like not how the, grow up, children. This is not how the world works. Basically, you get something complicated. Sometimes you get a no. Sometimes you get a, well, I'm really not sure. What would this really be like? Sometimes you get something that is like, has conditions on it that are so harsh that you would never do it. Like, like I want full editorial control, which in our case is something we never give. You might be able to, you might judge differently, only if it's like mainly about my beloved, pet kitten, just like that's not the film you want to make. The trick is, or in this case, like I'm not ready yet. And the trick is to determine how much you care, and if you care enough to figure out, well, okay, like I take this as a challenge, how are we going to make this happen? In our case, this kind of sparked a period of research where we got pretty deeply into the film that it was that we would want to make, and we wrote Justice Ginsburg again a few months later with a request saying, we wouldn't actually have to interview you right away. It actually takes quite a while to make a documentary. But we were wondering if it might be okay with you if we sort of got started interviewing some other people who have played key roles in your life and in your career over many decades. And we included with that email a list of about 20 people, basically because we wanted to show her that we had done our research and that we were thinking carefully and that we weren't just doing, this was a time when she was so much kind of in the ether because of all this internet craziness, and we wanted to make it clear that we weren't doing something sort of superficial and giddy, that we wanted to do something serious. So we sent her that email, and again we got a quick reply, and at that time, this was now in the spring of 2015, she said, I would not be willing to sit down with you for at least another 2 years, but if you are interested in talking to some other people, here are 3 names who are not on your list that I thought might be interested, that you might be interested in talking to. So again, we were like, this is a very positive sign. That's the point where we went out from CNN Films to get some very limited funding that they gave us at that point to just start filming. We said we're not going to get the justice on board unless we show her that we're moving forward with this project. And they agreed to give us enough funding that we could shoot 5 interviews. And of those 5 interviews included all 3 of the people that she had suggested, because we're not idiots like we the truth is, at the time that we booked those people, we were just like, this is just part of our clever strategy to manipulate like this into happening. As it turned out, all 3 interviews were fantastic, and all 3 ended up being in our film.
That brings up a really interesting point of, you have Justice Ginsburg, who's pretty used to being in front of the spotlight, especially at that time. So you have like an agenda, she's used to being in front of a camera, that's gonna go smoothly, you got really amazing interviews. But something like American Veteran is a much more, which is another film by Julie Cohen, if you haven't seen it, much more, the intimacy is there. How do you as a documentarian establish that trust, even with someone like Justice Ginsburg, that trust and being able to kind of dive deep into these people's lives as a media maker?
Yeah, establishing trust is everything for making documentaries. There's really no more important. First of all, you need that to book the person and get them to agree to be in your film, and you need it to get the kind of material that you want to get. And I think there's sort of 2 answers to how you build trust. One is kind of like the time and experience answer. The first time that you're with someone filming them, it generally doesn't necessarily go that great. They don't know they're not sure what to say or what to make of you. But especially if it's a story that you have to travel to go to, I've always found like when you that you're there doesn't impress people. That you came back really impresses someone. If you went and spent a couple days filming with someone and then you're gone for a couple weeks and then like here you are, like here I am again. And like the more you come back, the more trust you have. So one thing is that time and sort of letting comfortableness build. And the second one is like listening. Like when you ask, I think a mistake that a lot of young documentary makers, or I'd say new documentary makers, make is to have a very set thought of the questions that they want to ask a person, and then like no matter what happens, they're gonna like stick to that, like, oh my God, but now, like, first of all, the person starts, you have asked question number 2, and lo and behold, the person in their answer manages to fold in the answers to questions 8, yes. 12, and 17. Yes. And then, like, so after that's happened, like, don't go back to question 3. Like, now we're in 17 mode. Now go into 18. Like, you have to be sort of flexible. And sometimes people say things that are like really, really interesting that you hadn't expected, and that's good. You don't think like, oh, they've messed up my plans. Like, no, then we're gonna sort of roll with that. I mean, to me, coming up with clever questions. For particularly a documentary interview where you're recording it and you're going to be able to, pick and choose from your answers. Coming up with clever questions is really not the point. The best 2 questions in documentary filmmakers is question number 1 is tell me about X, and number 2, even more important, is tell me more about X. Mm-hmm. And when someone is saying something interesting, you want to hear more about it. And in a way, it sounds like I'm talking about interviewing technique now, but no, that's also about building trust, because if the person that you were talking to felt that they were being listened to, like that's actually how people come to trust one another, is by communicating. And there's also some probably body language and eye contact and things that like none of us really can control, so don't even really bother so much, but like, show up and listen. It kind of feels like I'm giving like relationship advice. It really so, but like I would say, like, I think this would work for dating as well. Like, keep showing up and keep listening.
That's a really good point. I mean, I do think you are being given this opportunity to tell somebody's story, and how if you're actually listening, then they're more likely to continue opening up to you. Can you talk about your work with Betsy as co-directors? I know it's very rare to see co-directing. How does that work for you?
Yeah, it's actually getting a little more common. Mm-hmm. I think part of the way that this made sense for us is actually we both come from the TV news world, where the roles of where directing and producing really aren't separate roles. They're all kind of rolled into one. So most documentaries would have a director and a producer. I don't really understand how that works or how the labor is divided. So we both just did both roles for them, which just felt natural to us. And we divided the work in different ways. I mean, we had so many kind of high profile interviews that we were trying to get that involved a lot of back and forth with the person's office, and just like a lot of coordinating and a lot of trust building with, in the end, I think we interviewed 24 people, which actually isn't a ton for a documentary. I know filmmakers that interview like 150 people and then end up using 10 of those. We were much more strategic about that. We used almost every interview that we shot. But for people or characters, we just split them straight down the middle, except for RBG, who was like the star who we were sort of both dealing with her office. But everyone else, one of them, even to the point where RBG has a son and a daughter, like I was dealing with the son and Betsy was dealing with the daughter. Like we just split everyone in half so that all the communications wouldn't have to be, it just made it like it just saved a lot of time, and that people felt like they had a real relationship with someone. And then whoever had the ongoing relationship with that person was who did the interview when we went. We both went to all the interviews, or to most of the interviews, but one of us would do the interviews. And in terms of, by the time you're putting the whole film together, then that's where Carla Gutierrez, who was our editor, comes in, and then you've got 3 people sort of making decisions together. I actually think 3 is a very good number for that, because you can't have a tie, which is actually quite useful when you're. I mean, there was a basic theory that where there wasn't going to nothing was going to go in our movie that like one of the 3 of us hated. But if like there was a difference of approach, or like, oh, should we do it this way or this way? Like it actually worked out like we basically did have majority rules. That would have been a problem if it had always been the same 2 disagreeing with the other, but it really wasn't like that. It would switch around all the time. So,
wow, yeah, I think that having that division of labor can be helpful in a lot of ways. I would love for you to talk about access and how you were able to get some of the archival footage that you had, as well as just like being let in on Justice Ginsburg's personal life. How did you get this access in even the courtroom settings too?
Yes. Well, the trick to getting the access to the parts of the story that you want is really about not being too pushy and not being impatient and being strategic. Like that is really hard because you're so eager to get the things that you want, and I think especially people that are newer to this game, the sort of gut reaction is like when you want certain things to be like to sort of run in with guns blazing and saying, oh, can we do this and this and this? But like that's not going to work, and you're going to have more trust as time goes on. So you have to sort of, it's all very like patience, grasshopper-y. You have to you have to just like let things unfold and wait for the right moments to ask for something. I mean, I think the key example in RBG is the scenes of her working out in the gym, which is something that we had in mind to film from the very time we started this project, but not something that we asked for until very, very near the end. Even when our executives were like, at that time, there were a lot of print stories going around about her workout, including one that came out in Politico, where a 26-year-old reporter had met with her personal trainer and had done the workout, and the article came out saying, I did RBG's workout and it nearly broke me, was the great headline. And that story went totally viral. So like everyone who was overseeing us on this film was like, workout, when are you get that? And we were like, we're not asking for it yet, just trust us. And we sort of learned, mostly when you're dealing with someone like Justice Ginsburg, there's a lot of layers. It's not like we're like, texting her and saying like, hey, what's up, see you tonight. Like, no, there's like a lot of people in between us for all of the communication, and the one exception is in a situation where we're seeing her face to face. And over the time, and it was there was a year and a half of actual shooting of the film. Over time, we came to notice, and we've had to shoot with her probably almost every month for that period. So we came to notice that when we asked her for something directly to her face, she almost always said yes. And when we asked for something in any other way, where it was going to go through layers of, gatekeeper people, the answer was usually no. So the whole idea was to figure out in which circumstances we were going to be face to face with her to make our case and ask a question. And so time had moved on. We didn't have our gym scene yet. We knew we wanted it. We actually hadn't done our main sit-down interview either, but that had been previously scheduled that it was going to happen in the summer of 2017 when the court session ends, because she prefers not to do big media interviews when the court's in session, when they're in the heart of their work. So that one we knew. But so in, I think, April of 2017, we sent a note to her assistant, who we've come to know pretty well, and just said, oh, you know what, we're going to be in DC interviewing Lilly Ledbetter, you know, who from the Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, who's a character in our story and really a great one. And because Justice Ginsburg had written a very notable dissent in Ledbetter's case that had gotten a lot of attention, we knew that she would know that it was cool that we had that interview set up. So we're like, oh, we're going to be in DC. Is there any way we could just stop in the justice's office and let her know kind of what progress we're making on the film? And we had sent this email like 2 weeks before we came to Washington. We didn't hear, we're not hearing anything. In fact, it turned out that Betsy was stuck in New York doing something, so I had gone down myself to do the Lilly Ledbetter interview. And we were told the justice office we were going to be there Thursday and Friday. And it was Thursday night, and I'm walking back to my hotel, and the phone rings, and it's the justice's interview. She's like, "Oh, you know, are you guys still in D.C.? Are you both in D.C.?" I was like, "Absolutely." She's like, "You know, could you, like, the justice is free, tomorrow at 4. Like, could you stop by?" I was like, "Absolutely. Like, see you then."
Yeah.
So I immediately called Betsy. I'm like, "You're like, guess what? You're coming down to Washington. Yeah. We're going to see the justice tomorrow." And we had just finished cutting a number of things, but including about a 2-minute scene at the beginning of the film that sort of tells the story of when RBG met Marty, and it included the archival home movie footage, and it was really a beautiful, lovely scene, and we had just been working on it all that day. Like we were like, you know what? We should show her this scene. We didn't show her any of the film other than that ever. That was the only piece she had seen until she came to the premiere, and I can tell you about that later. But we were like, let's show this to her. She's gonna like it. I think it'll, and we just did it on a laptop. We just brought it, we're like, we told her, like, things are going great. We've done this interview, we've done that interview. Like, you want to see, we just did a little excerpt that, like, and I had it on my, literally I just was, and she's like, and she was like, she was really interested in it. And she was watching it, and every, well, this is a weird typo, but it included some beautiful archival footage of Cornell University in, where she had gone in the 1950s. And as she saw that footage, which includes the famous Lake Cayuga that Cornell is set on, RBG began to quietly sing the Cornell theme song.
Oh my gosh.
It's a song that I know because my parents, who are also from Brooklyn and also RBG's age, also went to Cornell. So she's looking, she's like, far above Cayuga's waters. I'm like, oh my God, this is really going well. And there's a moment, that scene starts out in her confirmation hearing where she's talking about Marty and how much she loves him. And sitting behind Joe Biden in that scene is a very young, at that time, Senate Judiciary Committee, I think, staffer, later to become a justice, Elena Kagan. And she's in the back of the scene, and like, unless you're really in the know, you would notice. But when that scene came up, the justice goes, Elena. He was like, and it went like that. I mean, the scene is very short, but like each little interview subject that would come up, she would just really responded to every piece of video she would ever. So by the time the thing ended, she just was like misty-eyed. It's like, okay, this is really good. And we just went through a series of like, okay, here are the things we'd still like. Could we come to your home and shoot a scene of someone with you and your family? Could we do like we did that? And like each thing we're doing, she's saying yes to, leading up to the final one, which Betsy asked in a voice that was so meek, and Betsy is not a meek person, but it's so meek that even sitting right beside her, I could barely hear her. She said, might it be possible for us to see you doing your workout in the gym? And Justice Ginsburg, as you might know from the film, is a pauser. And when you ask her anything, she pauses after she completes a sentence herself. And when you ask her a question, she pauses. So there was a long pause. And she'd be great at poker. I don't know if she plays poker, but her pause, her face didn't give away anything. It was like, was she thinking like that's wonderful? Was she thinking like that's terrible? Was she thinking these two women are insane? Somebody call security. Like it wasn't really clear. But after her pause, she just said very calmly, yes, I think that would be possible. Betsy and I did not even exchange glances because we didn't want to let on that we were surprised by her response. We just continued the meeting, whatever. The meeting went great. It was like, we talked, she told us what was going on. The court was still busy in session. She was, writing dissents and stuff. And after about 45 minutes of talking, she just looked at us, she popped up the way that she will do sometimes, and she said, well, back to the salt mines. And she showed us out of her office. And we didn't say anything to her staff either, because we knew we were going to have to strategize this carefully, how we were going to, we were already in touch with her personal trainer, who was very enthusiastic to do an interview and stuff, but didn't, we hadn't mentioned to him that we were going to, try to film a workout. And we were just really quiet. We let the Supreme Court personnel show us out of the building, and once they had cleared away, we were like, ah! We just screamed.
I mean, and it's, the hit part, yeah.
So, but I think the moral to that story, if there is one, is patience is, timing is important and patience is important. The other film of mine that you referred to, which is obscure and I don't expect people to have seen, but it's called American Veteran, and you could see it if you went onto Amazon or YouTube or the various places where it's where you can rent it. Just saying.
It's wonderful.
Is about a quadriplegic veteran from the war in Afghanistan, and the nurse he met at a VA hospital fell in love with and married. The sort of equivalent hard to get access scene in that film was Nick's wife giving him a shower. And the example that I give to young students is I didn't go in the first day hi, I'm here, can we go into the shower now? I mean, obviously that's a sensitive question, and it wasn't until we'd been, it wasn't until we'd probably done 13 or 14 shoots together, knew each other really well, and had been working together for about a year and a half that I even raised that, and I actually raised it in a particular way that I came up with in advance, which is I'm not going to ask to sit there in the room while he's naked with my camera. I'm here's a GoPro, here's how you use it. Wendy, would you mind setting this up and filming, filming, which of course there's something a little bit weird about that. I mean, you're letting me, I brought it to a lot of film festivals and now it's available online. You're actually going to let the world see this, but it's still a little bit different. It's different to actually be in the room of something, and to also, I think they understood also that if there was some way that it came out that they weren't comfortable with, they could then they didn't have to send it to me. So it's just thinking of your subjects, where they're coming from and what their interests might be and what their concerns might be, rather than just running in like an eager puppy, demanding all of the things that you want.
Well, I think, that's helpful for our students who are about to go out and do all of that. She's gained so much popularity, Justice Ginsburg has gained so much popularity recently, and I think there's probably a lot of reasons why in the last 2 to 3 years she's just kind of become so huge. What do you think it is about her that makes her so compelling? I mean, and I also want to connect that to how do you choose as a filmmaker what stories to tell? Because so much of her life has been so important. She's done so many things. What cases do you decide to talk about? What personal parts of her life do you decide to talk about as a filmmaker? Yeah, I mean, in terms of why she's become such a big deal, and I think the two questions are related, because part of our decision-making process of what was in the film was going to have to do with why is it that people are so obsessed with her. We want to focus on the stuff that people are interested in. I think she's an interesting character, and she's interesting as a symbol. Of course, we got this idea in January of 2015, so the thought at that time that Donald Trump was going to be the president was literally nowhere in our minds. And if you had said that might come about, we, like a lot of the world, would have said that can't possibly happen. I mean, that was not something that was expected. So I do think she has come to feel more relevant in the age of Trump as a
symbol, just in general, sort of a symbol of defiance, but more broadly as sort of a symbol of our institutions that are steadfast and that hold a certain steadiness no matter what the political currents of the moment might be. And as someone that, although she is quiet and elderly and teeny, and never, is never like screaming her head off, and yet she actually has a lifelong history of really, with a lot of mental toughness, standing up for what she feels is important, even if it's like not really the way the trends are going at the time. Like, she's been doing that for a lifetime. That's interesting. That's part of what people like about her. That's sort of the, what made her an internet sensation was kind of her tough but non-legal, written in language that was broad enough that non-lawyers would understand it, dissents. And like, dissent kind of has a double meaning in a way. Like, yes, a dissent is a specific thing that's written by the non-majority of the Supreme, responding to an opinion of the Supreme Court saying why they think the court is going in the wrong direction. But like, the whole idea of dissenting against what seems to be the order of the day that you don't like, that was just an idea. People actually found that idea quite appealing in 2014, 2015. All of a sudden, the 2016 election comes along, and whatever people were finding appealing about her persona of dissent kind of multiplied in terms of its interest to, let's be honest, it's not like the nation at large, basically to liberal America, although we were quite surprised there's a fair amount of admiration for her among conservatives as well, not like the QAnon, not like Breitbart QAnon conservatives who think that she's been dead for for a long time, and that what you're seeing is like a hologram. But in terms of sort of mainstream conservatives, in fact, we had trouble finding a conservative voice to be in our film. We spoke to a number of people who wouldn't let me tell you their names, but were like, just like off the record, I love her and wouldn't want to. From some people who I was surprised to hear it from. So I don't know. That's why she's interesting. In terms of what to focus on, like we wanted to keep our story fair, and this fits in with what cases to cover. Also, we wanted to keep our story fairly narrow on the women's rights story because it was an area where the work that she had done as a lawyer really paralleled things that had happened and struggles that she had faced in her own life. We were like, those are the cases that we're getting into. Now, of course, as a lawyer, gender equality cases is all that she was arguing before the Supreme Court. She did some other work, but in terms of her Supreme Court arguments, that's what it was. But then she gets to the court, in fall of '93, and 25 years on the court, there's like a lot of cases to cover. Yes. And we're like, oh, this is going to be easy. We're going to, all we care about is gender equality and then dissents. Then interesting dissents on big constitutional issues that people are going to care about. Justice Ginsburg, as a lawyer, if this was a film that was just sort of for lawyers, she's an area of law that she cares greatly about, and so did Justice Scalia, and it actually has something to do with their friendship, is civil procedure. But we're trying to get people to pay tickets to come into a movie theater here. I mean, even what we were doing, there's a lot of ways you could pay. I mean, at its heart, our film is about, how you can use the due process clause of, how you can use the equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment to secure equality for the genders in the same way that had been used to secure racial equality. But I promise you that the two sentences I just said is not the way that we pitched our film, to anyone that we were trying to get funding from.
To get funding for.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, so sort of thinking about like what are the things that people are going to find interesting? How can we sort of narrow it down to tell one story that feels like, the great thing about RBG's cases is that there really was an arc that was there. We didn't have to impose that on it. She had her own struggles, as a woman in her era, she was really hampered at every turn. Mm-hmm. Plus then society at large, she was seeing that. Then she took that on because she couldn't get some of the jobs she might have liked to get. Like if things had unfolded differently, if there had been less discrimination at the time, she would have just become, a very happy managing partner at a big New York City corporate law firm, made a fortune, and we probably wouldn't have heard of her. So, because she was hampered, she decided that then she looked broader at issues affecting all women. She started fighting these cases. They were really interesting as this whole line of cases. Then things unfold in such an amazing way that she becomes herself a Supreme Court justice, and then as a Supreme Court justice, like she writes the big opinion that kind of caps it all off, which was the case that opened up the Virginia Military Institute to women. So it's like that is sort of like a narrative arc. So we were trying to keep tightly.
You did a really good job. That's an incredible life that you were presenting, and I think you all did it masterfully. Before I open it up to questions from the audience, I do want to hear about your premiere at Sundance and then getting the nomination for the Academy Award. Like, if you would talk about those two instances, because it's so amazing.
So our film premiered at Sundance in January of 2018. Other than the 2-minute excerpt of the Cornell love story that we'd shown the justice in her office, she had seen none of the film, and nor did she ask to see it, and she agreed to come out to Sundance and attend the premiere. Betsy and I were really, really nervous.
Yeah.
We sat right across the aisle from her, and the aisles were smaller than these aisles here, so we were really quite close to her. And through the entire, 96 minutes of our film, we just stared at her through the whole thing.
Did she laugh? Was she laughing?
We'd seen the movie. So from the very, and she was actually sitting next to Nina Totenberg, who, is in the film as well. And which was good because it allowed us to, she was like, there was a little bit of running commentary through it. And from the very opening notes where we have some classical music from the Barber of Seville, am I saying that correctly? I'm not even sure. She whispers to Nina, "I like the music." and it really just went on from there. She was really engrossed in it. She laughed a lot. I will say she particularly laughed at her own jokes, like when she said something funny, like she loved it. She laughed a lot. She cried a number of times. Some of that we expected. In the parts that were about Marty, we thought that she might get emotional, but what really threw us off was actually the first thing that made her tearful was there's a fairly early scene in the film where she goes to see the Santa Fe Opera and she's listening to this duet on stage, and we've combined the duet with a voiceover from her saying what music means to her and how it's like an electric current going through her. And watching herself watching the opera and saying those words, she turned to Nina and said, "Can I have a tissue?" And then she started to cry. We're like, oh my God.
That's amazing.
So that was amazing. But then the other Sundance thing to say, almost the more important moment of Sundance was when the justice met Robert Redford. earlier in the day before our premiere, she and Nina, they do all these, like in all these festivals now, it's not just a film festival, it's an ideas festival, and they have these talks and events and whatever. And she did a moderated discussion with Nina Totenberg on stage, like you and I, except much, much cooler.
Yeah, way cooler. Love to have been that one.
And the day before, the Sundance people told us that Robert Redford was thinking about coming and doing the introduction of that talk. And we decided, Betsy and I decided, like, we're not going to mention that to the Justice's office, because, like, if it does, like, who knows? I mean, he's running around doing a zillion things. What if he doesn't? We didn't want her to remember Sundance as the time that she didn't meet Robert Redford.
Right.
So she didn't know anything about that. We see her for the first time at that little filmmakers lounge, they call it. We were all in a green room together and getting ready for her to go on stage. And then after we had a little conversation and just and walked out of the room, then all of a sudden there he shows up in his like flannel shirt and cowboy boots or whatever, and like he opens the door. And normally Justice Ginsburg, she's so little and she sits in these big chairs, and even that day she sort of sits on her chair a little bit like the Queen. You come over to her, you sort of like Justice, you sort of like, I mean, she deserves respect and people give it to her. Everyone else that had come in to see them were like, oh, hello, Justice, and they're like, coming. When Robert Redford walked in the room, she just popped right up out of her chair. And she walked over, they had a whole conversation. He didn't even need to say, it was weird, because she wasn't expecting to see him, but she knew just who he was. And later on in the day, there was a luncheon, and like Ashley Judd came and sat down next to her, and she was sort of looking like, I don't know, like, who are you? She looked over to Nina again, like, who is this person? But Robert Redford made quite an impression on her. And after the screening of our film, she wasn't supposed to be the part of the Q&A, but an audience member asked what she thought. She again popped right up. She came down to the front of the stage and talked about how much she enjoyed the film, which was obviously like an incredible moment. And someone asked her, and then she continued to like hold court, like we basically didn't do a Q&A. The whole thing was her, which was great. It was definitely like one of those experiences like you will only have once in life. And someone asked her at the end, like, what do you think of Park City? And she said, no, what do you think of Sundance? And she said, well, Park City is beautiful. It looks so much like Switzerland, and Robert Redford is very good looking. So, it basically doesn't get better than that.
It doesn't.
As far as I'm concerned.
That's a great premiere.
Right.
Well, let's go ahead and open it up.
And getting nominated for an Oscar was very, very nice.
Yes, I'm sure. Oh, and that whole thing. So let's go ahead if anybody has any questions for Julie Cohen.
I do.
All right, go ahead. Or do we have a microphone? Here it is, here we go. And if other people want to, you can line up too. Yes, please do, come on up. So we can all hear you. If you have one, just go ahead and line up.
Hi.
Hi.
So, as a filmmaker myself, I like to think about projects that I can do that implement some sort of change. And I guess that's more relevant with documentaries. So I guess, what feedback have you gotten that's like specific to, I guess, hopefully the sort of change you were looking to implement, or like, I mean, we're all aware of RBG, but like, you know what I mean? Spreading that awareness, or like the specificity of your documentary.
Yeah, well, first I'll say, we made our film to tell a good story. That was our primary goal. But that said, because of the sort of high profileness that it ended up happening, that it ended up having, and because we had in the end, two distributors, aside from CNN Films, who had been our producing partners throughout. The film at Sundance was picked up by Magnolia, which is an indie film distributor, but also by Participant Media, and they specialize in kind of making change, basically using film to make change. So, you know, first of all, I think that when you talk about like sort of making change, it's not, or like, you know, kind of like doing good things in the world, or like sometimes it gets a non-fun tinge to it. Like it sounds like, oh, but that's going to be work and like medicine and whatever. Like I actually feel like the fact that people found seeing our film to be a really joyful experience, like in some ways maybe that's the best change of all. Like people that were kind of feeling a little dejected sort of were like, hey, that kind of gave me a little bit of a like boost, a little, you know. And I think to the impact that meant the most to us in the end, which wasn't something we had anticipated at all, was the impact on kids, because it just became a big family and kid movie. Children loved it. We didn't expect that. My niece was 7 when the film came out, and I said to, you know, my brother, like, you know, of course you can bring her and like bring her to a Q&A that I'm doing. I'm sure she'll think it's fun to see Aunt Julie, but like, is she really gonna like this? And like, she just like loved it. She was so into it. And then when we found that really across the board from kind of 7 and older, and the idea of, you know, actual children as well as young women who, you know, there's been a sense in recent years, I mean, I guess this has been going on for, there's been a sense that like older feminists and younger feminists like don't see eye to eye on that many things. Like they just have very different views of the world. Partly, I think, you know, well, I'm kind of maybe coming from the older side, so maybe it's like, I would say part of that having to do with, in some cases, the younger generation not understanding some of the things that their mothers and grandmothers went through, and not knowing what the world, like how quickly the world has changed and what it used to be, and what the struggles for change. So the idea that there was something like the Big Venn Diagram, where like what young feminists care about and what older feminists care about, like in that overlap is just like RBG. Like that's what, like, you know, she's really a figure that different age groups found some real common ground on, and in a way that I think was actually quite meaningful for all concerned. I know I heard from a lot of older women than myself who felt like incredibly heartened to see, you know, the impact on 20-somethings, and similarly I heard from 20-somethings like responding to sort of hearing some things, you know, from their parents and grandparents that they hadn't heard before. Like sometimes the thing about discrimination and being treated badly, that's been an issue in our society, I think, for a while, is that for whatever weird reason, the shame tends to attach to the oppressed rather than the oppressor. So like if you're treated badly, the inclination is like not to talk about it, to keep it all secret. I mean, we've seen this. I mean, yes, it's true in the women's rights case. I think it's probably even maybe more true having to do with racial discrimination, having to do with gay rights. And like, our films felt like it kind of gave some people permission to tell stories. Like my favorite screening was a friends and family screening that we did in the DC area where I grew up, where my parents and their friends all came. And you know, the demographics are really perfect because as I mentioned, my parents are in their 80s. They and like all their friends like grew up in Brooklyn. They're Brooklyn Jewish people who all went to Cornell, so they could really relate to this film. But after this screening, one after the other of my parents' friends, these are people I've known for, you know, decades, the women started telling me about the ways that their careers had been hampered that I'd never heard before. Like, you know, in one case, a woman who had gotten a master's degree in economics and was hoping to get a job in economics in Chicago, and it's like, you know, another one who's really a close friend telling me that her in-laws had told her as soon as she got pregnant, like, okay, now, you know, you're done as far as anything but like taking care of our husband, of our son and our grandchildren. So don't even think about working like in this menacing way. Like, you know, so the idea that one person's story that actually connects to a lot of people's stories can open up these conversations seems good to me. So, sorry, I went on too long for that, but there was my answer.
Okay, hello.
Hi there.
My question is, who are the 3 people that Justice Ginsburg suggested you interview? Yes. And if she hadn't mentioned them to you, would you have thought of them?
Yes, so one of them we might have, and 2 of them we probably wouldn't have. The 2 of the 3 were actually colleagues of hers from the ACLU Women's Rights Project. We had on our list others of her colleagues from the main one that we had in mind was Brenda Feigen, because we knew who had been her co-counsel on her first case before the Supreme Court, Frontiero, and we knew that she had been in the court for that, so she just seemed like the obvious one. Justice Ginsburg recommended 2 others, Kathleen Paradas and Arya Nair, both of whom had a lot to say. Kathleen Paradas we actually probably would have thought of, but Arya Nair we didn't. But the third was the judge I mentioned earlier, Judge Harry Edwards, who served with her on the Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit, who we almost certainly wouldn't have thought of. I mean, there are a number of judges on that court. The reason that she had him in mind is that they're close friends, which we didn't know, and he turned out to be just like such a delightful, like, we actually used quite a bit of him, just like, you know, just, you know, the danger of lawyers and judges is that they're going to seem too serious and austere, and he just had such a, like, you know, not only was he telling funny, smart stories, but he had such a gleam in his eye the whole time. We just, like, it was because that was one of our early interviews, we were so pleased with it. We were like, oh my God, this is going to be great, and we used him a lot, so.
Thank you.
So one of the things that was most surprising to me and meant a lot to me was not the emphasis, but the parts where it talked about how gender discrimination also in some way affected men, and I was wondering if you were worried about like giving ammo to the MRAs or making it seem too much like there's taking too much away from the women's side of the story, and if you thought about that, how you addressed it or
yeah, I mean, you know, the whole idea that gender inequality hurts both men and women, and actually children is even part of her argument, was a fairly original insight from Ruth Bader Ginsburg as a young lawyer, a really smart one that I think she mainly made for strategic purposes, because she understood, as we say in the film, that she was talking to a group of 9 men, so why not try to reach people where they are, but also is true and makes a lot of sense. And I think, you know, I think your generation has come to realize that a little bit more, that there's a real reality to that, especially in terms of, you know, issues having to do with childcare. Like, no, it's like if we're dividing it down the line, like, oh, guy out working, you know, lady home with home and kids, like both parties are not getting as good an experience as they could have, and she understood that. We did understand that we were going to both emphasize that a fair amount, and by choosing to make one of our main of her clients that we made characters, one of them was a man, by choosing him, and also by making the emphasis on the romantic love story. That was a very conscious choice. It's part of RBG's life and approach, and like making Marty into a supportive husband, feminist hero in our story was something that we wanted to do and was important. We felt was important to do, and we thought would be moving and enjoyed, by audiences. I think you bring your own experiences to these films, and the truth is that Betsy and Carla and I all have like super supportive, like all, I'm gonna, here we are like working all hours on this film, and like our husbands are home, helping out in every way they can to, Carl's the only one with kids at home at this point, but really like doing what they need to do to help out, and like that story was moving to us and seemed like recognizing a man for something other than like his own career achievements, which actually he, already had some, but like recognizing him for the role, he saw his main function, like he knew he'd married this woman who was could make it all the way to the top, and he was gonna push her to get there, and like to us, that was like a beautiful feminist love story that we wanted to tell.
Thank you.
Thank you again for being here. I'm curious, the stories you hear from lawyers who have argued their case in front of the Supreme Court, they talk about how nerve-wracking a process it is because they're going up against these incredibly formidable minds. They have to be so prepared, so researched, have thought all of the angles, and then be so strong to just stand up and at times argue against these incredible minds in front of them. I'm curious what, for you, it was like to prepare to talk with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and then also just what is it like to be in a room with someone of that level of intellect?
Yes, well, I would say making a documentary with Justice Ginsburg is much easier than arguing a case before the Supreme Court, like truthfully, because a documentary interview has a certain structure in which the filmmaker is in control, and what's actually so scary about a Supreme Court argument and what makes Ruth Bader Ginsburg's style as a young lawyer so impressive is how intimidating that situation is. Like sometimes the lawyer can't even get out two sentences. Like it's not like you have a prepared debate and then you like are going back and forth. A justice can interrupt at any time and ask any question about anything. Like literally, like in such and such a they can ask about some, and sometimes they do that. Oh, it feels like they're just trying to, it's like they'll bring up some other related case, but there are hundreds of related cases. So just to like what about this provision in the federal code? It's a really difficult experience. So I would not compare our own experience making the film to that. It's just not as hard. As far as being in RBG's presence, it's really quite something. I mean, even her childhood friends who we interviewed, who you saw briefly in that clip, and I felt like very much made my case about the joys of interviewing the elderly, and also actually I love interviewing people together, like in pairs, especially if they know each other really well. It just creates a whole new energy. But even they said as a young person, even when she was a child, she had this really unusual quiet magnetism was how they described it. She has, like, even though she's really quiet, but she just has a lot of charisma. Like I mentioned, I had interviewed her previously for another film I made, which was in 2013. And when she walked into the room, like you were like, wow, like also like you're used to seeing her in robes, and she actually has this incredible fashion sense. So when you're seeing her in a full outfit, you're like, oh my God, her blouse, her earrings, like, and just like she's just one of those people that just everybody, like anything she says, she just has a lot of star power, and add to that the just insane amount of attention surrounding her during the time that we were making this film and then out there promoting it, and how much that was just increased. I mean, we kept thinking, honestly, when we first came up with the idea, we were like, is anyone, in 2015, we're like, is anyone still going to care about RBG by the time we make a movie? Like, is this just like her 15 minutes and just, the level, I mean, it was just it was last week that she filled the Verizon Center in Little Rock, so.
Yeah, 16,000?
Yeah, the place, they had sort of boxed off so that no one would have an obstructed seat, so I think in the end there were 15,000 people in there, but there was a whole waiting list of thousands of others, so.
Thank you.
I think this will be our last question.
So you started off learning law, but why did you decide to change your career?
Actually, it didn't go that way. I got a master's degree in law after I was already a journalist, because I did a special program for journalists who want to understand the law better. So I actually did that master's in law program to have a better understanding of law to allow me to be a journalist that covered legal issues, because I had started covering trials and really enjoyed it and wanted to understand the law better.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask, have you been in touch with RBG and how she's doing? Because I know she's been going through a lot.
Yes, I mean, obviously, Justice Ginsburg's health is of great concern, not only to those who know her personally, but to the nation as a whole. So it's been like really a privilege to be in a position to remain in touch with her as we have. Betsy and I went to visit her really just to say hi in July. And we went to her chambers and spent time with her. It was hilariously, she told us this at the time, but it's only broken out into the news this week that this happened, so I feel like I can now talk about it. She was all aflutter because she had just met, like an hour before we were there, Jennifer Lopez and Alex Rodriguez were in her office visiting her. She had sort of set it aside as like a day to like people that were asking to visit her, like as like a visiting day. So that was again like sort of a weird. She that was like the first thing she said to us, like, "Well, it's been quite a day. Like J-Lo was here." I will add that while she was that J-Lo was doing an arena concert that night, and while the justice was invited to attend it, she allowed us how that really isn't her kind of music. Amazingly, actually, the day that we saw her, just according to the timeline that we realized, later as some of the more recent stuff about her health came out, she was, after she had already, been told that there was a small tumor on her pancreas, and yet she obviously didn't mention that to her. She actually seemed great and really energetic. Then she comes up to New York City and was in New York for about a month while she was getting these frequent, sort of targeted outpatient radiation on this tumor, which is a state-of-the-art treatment thing. And while she's in New York to get, these serious treatments, rather than just like resting up, she's going to, if you stay on social media, you'll see how much she's out and about. She's everywhere. Like seeing the Fiddler on the Roof in Yiddish, where she met Kate McKinnon, who does the impersonation of her on Saturday Night Live. She went and saw Moulin Rouge. She's doing a zillion things. Then since the treatment has ended, she went down and gave a talk at Duke, and then she did this talk at the Verizon Center. When we were in her office, she mentioned to her, like, oh yeah, I'm giving a talk in Little Rock next month. They told me that the venue they were going to do sold out, so now we're going to go into a place that has 18,000 seats. And she said that, and we're like, oh yeah, that's nice. And as soon as we left the office, I said to Betsy, like, that can't be right. She must have meant 1,800. Like, she's not going to. What is she going to go to? She's going to go to a sports arena? Yep. Like, that's crazy. Yep. And then last week, there's two lessons. I mean, one thing is like, oh my God, like yes, RBG really is a rock star and can fill like a huge venue. That's number one. But number two, like, she's really never wrong on the little I said about the red pen and the corrections. Like that basic scenario in the couple years that we were making the film and have seen her, that's come up a number of times. Well, she'll she'll say something, and you're like, yeah, she's got to be. That's got to be. And then you check it, and you're like, God damn it, she was right.
It's good to hear that. And then finally, what's next for you? I know you can't say too much, but
yes, our timing is too bad because I think within the next couple weeks there's going to be an announcement coming out, but after the success of RBG, certainly Betsy and I were approached with a lot of possible subjects, but we tend to gravitate to sort of our own thoughts. And basically, we have 2 films that are in the works that we're shooting already right now. I can't yet say what they're about, but I can say that they're both about women.
Yes. All right. Thank you so much to our esteemed guest, Julie Cohen. Thank you for coming out to Athens and to Ohio University and for spending this time with us. You'll keep an eye out for these films coming out in the near future. So once again, thank you so much.